Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to US Modernist Radio. Join host George Smart and Frank King as they talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. Show your support by reviewing us at iTunes or Google Play or even Open Table, and visiting US Modernist's huge honkin' archives at usmodernist.org. And now, the guys architect Bjarke Ingels once winked at, and yes, both of them blushed, Frank King and George Smart.
Well, hello, I'm Rebecca Laney, and I'm in for Frank King, who is cruising in Alaska today. No, he's not in a club dancing to techno. It's the ship kind of cruising, with lifeboats and midnight buffets. Support for US Modernist Radio comes from Mod Homes Realty. If you're having a hard time finding or selling a modernist home, Sarah Sonk of Mod Homes Realty is a wonderful, intelligent, lovely, single lady who loves Luther Vandross, flowers in springtime, and pomegranate martinis.
Ooh.
Oh, no, wait a minute. That's her match profile.
Yeah.
Sarah Sonk is actually a real estate agent who gets modern just like you do. She's totally down with your art and architecture and has the expertise, experience, and track record to close your deal. www.modhomesrealty.com or 919-601-7339.
Our very special guest today is architect Eric Lloyd Wright. His amazing career spans 7 decades. Following his apprenticeship with his grandfather Frank Lloyd Wright from 1948 to 1956, he moved back to Los Angeles to work with his father, the esteemed Lloyd Wright, until 1978. He has since been in private practice, creating his own projects plus helping clients of his grandfather and father restore and expand their buildings. Eric is the Obi-Wan Kenobi of architecture, spanning 150 years of incredible modernist design, as this year marks the 150th anniversary of the birth of Frank Lloyd Wright. Eric was involved in the design of buildings you know and love, such as the Guggenheim Museum in New York, Monona Terrace in Madison, Wisconsin, the Wayfarers Chapel in Palos Verdes, California, plus restoring older Wright projects such as Aldbrass in South Carolina, the Storer and Ennis residences in Los Angeles, and his own house, still under construction in Malibu. Welcome, Eric.
Well, thank you. Privileged to be on your program.
So, Eric, you've been working for, 30 years on your own house? Is this like the shoemaker not having any shoes for his own kids?
I think it is. It's a labor of love.
Tell us a little bit about how you found this site for the house and how this long construction project started.
Well, the site was actually found by my father. When I was in high school, he and I used to go through what is called the Santa Monica Mountains here in Los Angeles, looking for sites that had a good view of the ocean and of the San Fernando Valley. And he, after several years looking, found this site in Malibu overlooking the Pacific with a spectacular view, just spectacular. It's up at 2,000 feet, and it gets above the smog level of the city. And it's still mountainous and with a lot of native vegetation on it. It hasn't been as cleared and developed as other parts of the area. My father always wanted to build on it, but never could quite get things together to get the money or the time. So I said, well, I'm not going to end up not having lived on the land. So I said, I'll just start construction and see what happens, do as much as I can. And being an architect, I couldn't get a very big loan. Architects don't make very much money. It's surprising. Most people don't understand. architecture really is an act of love, a love of the environment and shaping the physical form of society. It's a very important, but it is also an art form as well as a business, as well as science, technology, engineering. It incorporates everything that we use to create our modern civilization. The architect is involved. So that's one of the reasons I've been struggling along with my project, and it's about 70% complete.
So are you going to bill yourself for services rendered? I imagine that would be a high amount.
Yes, it would be.
Are you in the home now?
No. I'm next to the home. What we did is we set up some storage containers and then spanned between the storage containers so you don't have the look of a storage container, and you can have spaces that flow and aren't boxed in like a storage container. And so we live in these, what I call temporary structures.
Temporary for 30 years?
Yeah, temporary for 30 years.
Your wife must have a lot of patience. I know that my wife would not put up with that more than about 3 months.
No, she is amazing. Of course, being able to live up here on the land is just such a blessing in itself. I could do it if I had to pitch a tent.
I imagine when your father bought the land in 1956, he bought it for some amazing price that was maybe high then, but was a deal now. 24 acres in Malibu is quite a spread.
Well, we're up in the mountains. As I said, we're 2,000 feet up. And it was, at that time, it was considered outside the commute area of Los Angeles. So the prices of land were quite low. And it was all native shrub. There was no electricity, no water. And we had to wait for the electricity to be brought up on our county road.
Eric, you were a student of your grandfather's. I was wondering how that was for you. Was he meaner to you than the other students, or less mean, or how did it work?
I think he was less mean.
Less mean.
What I want to say is that he spent a lot of time with the students, and he didn't treat me any differently than he did his other apprentices. He didn't like the term student, he liked the term apprentice. And we were truly apprentices because our learning was learning by doing. And we learned about architecture by actually building structures, by going out and supervising, by creating the drawings. All of that was done by the apprentices. And all of Taliesin West in Scottsdale, Arizona, which is his winter home, was built by the apprentices. So my treatment was what all the other apprentices had. I wasn't especially favored. Well, I was a little bit, because I could go and have 2 or 3 times a week I had dinner with them, my grandparents. It was a really wonderful experience to have him come in the drafting room and sit down beside you. Our stools that we had could always seat up to 2 people. And he would come and sit down beside you and critique your drawing that you were doing of his work. So you were actually experiencing the creation of these great architectural works right before your eyes. It was quite an experience.
Your father was an apprentice to him as well, right?
My father was, yes, in the very early days, although he had been drawing for my grandfather since he was 15, living in Oak Park, Illinois. He worked in the office there for my grandfather, and went to the University of Wisconsin for a year, where he studied agriculture, landscape work, and eventually became a landscape architect as well as a regular architect.
Your father, Lloyd Wright, must have had some discussions with you about what your career would be, was it just always assumed that you would go into architecture too, or did you have another passion like wanting to be an actor or wanting to be a plumber or something like that? I mean, was it always assumed you'd become an architect?
Well, originally, this is when I was about 15. I wanted to really be a farmer, animal husbandry. I loved animals. I liked the idea of farming, being out on a farm.
How did that go over with your father and grandfather?
Oh, they were very sympathetic to it. In fact, my grandfather said, well, why don't you come back in the summer to Taliesin in Wisconsin? That's his Wisconsin home. We have a farm. We raise dairy and chickens, and you can work on our farm in the summer. So I said, that sounds wonderful. So I took him up on it and came to spend the summer. I worked on the farm and also did construction work. We were always building something. And the young apprentices that were there were just not much older than I was. So I started making friends with them. There were quite a few apprentices who were there just out of high school. And I had helped them at night with making models and working on doing duplicate drawings. I loved it. It was really a marvelous experience. And the enthusiasm, especially of the young apprentices who were there for my grandfather and his work and the way we lived, it was a very wonderful community living that we had at Taliesin. When I came home, I said, by golly, I really loved architecture. I loved all the models that we had around the drafting room and the drawings. It was really a magnificent, creative environment. And I said, architecture is really where I want to go. I want to be working with nature, not against it, but for it. This is one of the wonderful ways of doing that, being an architect. I asked him, my grandfather, if I could come and join the fellowship, whose Taliesin Architecture was called the Fellowship, the Taliesin Fellowship. And he said, well, certainly you can come ahead when you graduated from high school. So when I graduated from high school, I went to work with my grandfather.
And there was no turning back from that point?
No way. It was too ingrained, too wonderful. And what could be done for society by being an architect was wonderful. It still is wonderful. I'm not always in sympathy with all the building forms that are going on today. A lot of it, I feel, is just to be different, to be unique. And that to be different and unique should come out naturally out of the work. It shouldn't be forced on it. And so much architecture is. Although I'm surprised at just how much is work that is not really moving forward, but is static, almost retrograde. We've almost gone back to the 20s. Here, especially in Southern California, with Mediterranean style and just builder-style houses.
There are a lot of those, that's for sure.
There was a start at one time at the end of World War II when companies like, it's called Eichler Homes.
Oh, sure.
In San Francisco and L.A. They were doing some very interesting work, what people call modernist today. Of course, it's interesting your term modernist, because I've always thought of modern means of today, and these houses were designed before today, but they are of today in a sense. But what surprised me was we were starting down that road towards Eichler Homes, and there was the work of my father and Schindler, Neutra, that was presenting what we call modern architecture of today. But that has basically died out. It never really has taken a hold. It's only a few special houses, but the developers are not taking that form. They're taking retrograde forms and modified ranch houses. Now, the original ranch house was actually started by Frank Lloyd Wright. That was the early Usonian houses, and he developed what is now called the open plan.
Oh, yes.
Where the dining room, actually what happens, you go from the living room to the dining area, which is still part of the living room, and the kitchen was open to the living room. That way he could build these small homes that were about 1,000 square feet. He called them Usonian houses. And he was hoping that this would be something that the average person could afford. And he did have. He designed them for teachers, for a mailman, and for other people. It was to be an architecture of the people. And he kept working with those forms, even though he was this great architect who had produced Falling Water and Eagle Feather and All Brass. He would go and produce these small little 1,000 square foot houses, some of them built by the owner. So he was always very interested in what could be the architecture for the average American, the middle class. He said, we should give them an architecture that they deserve. Now, the type of work that he was doing in the 30s is called modernist. We always love labels. So now it's modernist.
Eric, did the fashion of naming a house come from your grandfather, or did that from the clients themselves? Because it seemed like many of his projects had a nickname.
They did. I think it was a combination. But the houses that I worked on, he usually named it. When he was doing the sketches, preliminary studies, he would give it a name.
And it would be some kind of organic, woodsy name sometime, or a Native American name. It was always a beautiful name associated with it.
Well, if you could take all brass, originally it was the Old Brass Plantation in South Carolina, and he changed it to Ald Brass. He liked
the Old English.
Scottish English.
And there is a tradition in the British Isles of naming houses.
Yeah.
So it's...
I guess that's a better nickname than the Gherkin, which is a very famous building in London.
Yeah.
Oh, you're right.
Eric, you were involved, and not many people know this, I think, in designing the Guggenheim, one of the most famous museums in the world, and certainly in New York, against which there was a lot of resistance to that kind of architecture in Central Park. Can you tell us about what it was like to work on that project?
I had a very small part in that. I was a draftsman doing detailing work and some planning. I remember working out how we work out the restaurant and so forth and getting it to fit in. But I love the renderings of the Guggenheim. There were several different renderings made of it, and then worked on the model. That was a wonderful experience, building the model. Model was built by the apprentices. By the time I got onto it, Solomon Guggenheim had passed away, and Hilla Rebbe, his associate, I think had passed away as well when I came to the fellowship. So I didn't have the experience of knowing Mr. Guggenheim.
I'm struck when I go into the Guggenheim and you get past the initial entryway that there are these tiny little elevators which seem way too small for the building. But then when you get to the top floor and it opens up, that typical Wright experience of the discovery of the building really hits you there on the top floor.
Yeah, that's right. Now, things like elevators restrooms and other things, he was always undersizing. They were elements that can be modified to a point that is too much. And of course, the elevators of the Guggenheim are too small. As you say, you do have that compression. You're packed into this little elevator. You go up and you're released under this glass skylight, and it's just a marvelous sense of environment and marvelous sense of the atmosphere around you to have that experience. And of course, that's the same way with entering the Guggenheim. You enter it low. There's a low walkway going in, leading in, and then it takes you into the central area of the spiral, and that explodes up above you, and it's exciting, just exciting experience to have that open up. And that's the wonderful thing about the Guggenheim. I consider it one of the really great organic buildings. My grandfather labeled his architecture as organic architecture. It means working with nature, natural elements, the natural ability of human beings. And that entrance to the Guggenheim is a marvelous projection of space, because you come in, as I said before, a low ceiling, and then it opens up into this marvelous spiral space with a glass skylight. And what he did with the spiral is it just isn't this spiral on top of itself. The spiral gets bigger as it goes up, so that when you get to the glass skylight, you just explode out into space.
The Guggenheim is, of course, one of New York's most beloved buildings. But at the time, and certainly during its construction and planning, people hated it.
Yeah, it was too bad. They didn't understand the building. And it wasn't until they had a Calder exhibition, that is, Calder had these moving pieces of sculpture that would move with just a breath of air. And he hung them all through the space in the museum. And that was three-dimensional in that you could get all around the piece of sculpture. They didn't understand, too, that he had, when he built the walls, the spiral going up, the walls leaned approximately 5% back. And he said, well, that's the way a painter's easel is. A painter's easel is never vertical. It's always slightly tilted. And that's the way the artist is looking at his work. And I want to give the visitors to the museum the same experience as the artist. Also, pitching them back, he had lighting built into the concrete slab, and that shown over the drawings. What the unfortunate part of the building of the museum is that my grandfather had already died when they were finishing it, and the curator, Sweeney, had them take out the mechanisms that mounted the painting against the wall, and he put metal brackets sticking out of the wall, pipes coming out of the wall, holding the paintings vertical, just what my grandfather was trying to avoid. And he was trying to get back to have the artist had it on a leaning easel.
I want to talk about your father, Frank Lloyd Wright, Jr., known as Lloyd Wright. In doing some of the research about him, I was really amazed how little information is out there compared to how much information is out there about your grandfather, even though your father did a tremendous number of buildings and houses and was embraced by a lot of the Hollywood community. Did he feel like he was working under the shadow of your grandfather, or why aren't we seeing more about Lloyd Wright?
I think it's working under the shadow. When there's four great modernist architects who lived in Los Angeles at that time. There was Schindler, there was Neutra, there was my father and my grandfather.
Because Lautner came along later, right?
Yes. He was working at the same time that Schindler and Neutra were working in Los Angeles. They came along in the late 20s, and my father was the same period as Neutra and Schindler. And they were getting more exposure than my dad because of my grandfather. My grandfather was getting a tremendous amount of exposure. I remember hearing about how Neutra and Schindler had an exhibition of their work, and they wanted to have an exhibition with grandfather.
Yes.
As part of it. But he said, I will, but it has to be of my work. Otherwise, I won't participate. So when they put up their exhibition, they had the three of them, Frank Lloyd Wright, Schindler on the right side of it, Neutra on the left side, and my grandfather's portrait in the middle. That was the entrance to the exhibit. And my grandfather was just furious that they were just using him to capitalize his name for their work. But a friend of his, who was the art critic of the Los Angeles Times, turned to him and said, Frank, don't get so mad at them. Christ was crucified between two thieves.
Well put.
So that was his feeling. He was concerned about his work, and he wanted really more control.
Eric, I read a lot where your grandfather, of course, had many apprentices, many fans, many clients. I didn't read where he had a lot of colleagues, that people he would just kind of hang out with and would be friends. Did he have that kind of community as well?
No, it wasn't so much that community. Of course, the Taliesin's were always out in the country, both in Wisconsin and Arizona. They weren't right in the city, although Arizona now is, and Taliesin West. But Taliesin, Wisconsin is still, it's out in the countryside. You're 40 miles west of Madison. So there wasn't a lot of day-to-day or week-to-week contact with other people because of the distances. So what he would do is he would invite people out to spend the weekend at his house.
You had to come to him, though.
That's right. They had to come to him, and they had to stay over a day at least.
Was there ever a client of your father's or your grandfather's that intimidated them?
I don't think so. Certainly not of my grandfather. He had a presence that just made people respond positively towards him. There wasn't any feeling of wanting to get into an argument.
He was very imposing, I understand.
He did have arguments occasionally. He had a nature that he could get very angry with people if they were really making what he felt was major mistakes or major misunderstandings.
I understand it was quite unusual to get a compliment from your grandfather.
He was not too easy with his compliments, although I will say for the young students, and there were many of them who were there like I was, just out of high school, he was very patient, and would every day always sit down with one or two of them, see what they were doing, and to critique their work. And then we had what was called the birthday box, and that was that we would, on my grandfather's birthday, June 8th, we would all make a drawings of hypothetical buildings that we would design. And we would give that to him as either the birthday box or the Christmas box twice a year. And he would critique the drawings. And he was very good at critiquing. he didn't get too upset, except if you were older. If you had been an apprentice for 5 or 6 years with him, he did expect a lot more from you, and he could really get angry.
And with other professional architects, his praise was fairly limited.
Very limited.
Eric, in the birthday box and the Christmas box, these critiques, would you consider that that was a gift from your grandfather?
Well, I considered it like a gift. All the apprentices were eager to do this, to get his opinion of what your work was and how you were progressing. We all look forward to these boxes.
Eric, in this generation, you have 2 sons, right, Devin and Corey?
Yes.
Did they go into architecture, or their kids? I mean, how far along has this gone in your genealogy?
Well, my oldest son is a landscape contractor, and my youngest son is a musician. So we sort of branched out.
Did it skip a generation? Are any of your grandchildren in design?
No, I've got a grandchild, but she's only 2 years old, 2.5. So we'll see.
Maybe you should start a birthday box for her.
Yeah.
That's right. She's a wonderful drawer. She loves to draw.
I wanted to ask you on a different note. You did a house for, I think it was your half-brother and his wife, Anais Nin?
Yes. Yes, that was a house in an area we call Silver Lake in Los Angeles. And my brother was a teacher, and Anais was a writer, very well-known feminist writer. So my brother is really my half-brother. He's Rupert Pohl, and he had me do their house for them. It was a small little Usonian house, very nice. It was 1,000 square feet.
Rupert and his wife were very influential at a time in Los Angeles where this bohemian culture was growing. They would hang out with Schindler, as I read, and they would hang out with other actors and poets and musicians and created this kinds of artistic culture, which we see in so many cities today. But at that time, it really was going full strength in Los Angeles.
Yes, it was, and they were part of that whole movement, and they were in touch with people who were very active in developing that advanced bohemian. It really wasn't so much bohemian as just advanced artists that had a unique form, style of writing, form of drawing. And it was not just Los Angeles, but it also included San Francisco.
Did you keep in touch with Anais throughout her life?
Yes, I did. She would occasionally invite me and Mary, my wife, over for what used to be called soirees, parties at her house with different artists.
The parties of that group were notorious in Los Angeles as being the fun places to go.
Well, I don't know if they were notorious, because they were the group that I knew of with Anais. These were all forward-thinking philosophers, writers. I mean, really a wonderful, educated group, as well as being nonconformist artists. It was quite an atmosphere.
One last question, Eric. Who are your favorite architects today? Whose work do you really like?
I like the Spanish architect.
Calatrava?
Yes, Calatrava. I think he's done some wonderful work. I like Foster.
Norman Foster in London?
Yeah, in England. And then, well, those are pretty much
Okay.
I feel.
Thank you so much, Eric, for being on with us today. I really enjoyed having you.
Well, I was very glad to be on. My memory isn't as sharp as it should be, but I hope that I've shed some light on the background of my grandfather and my background.
You have. Such a pleasure. I'm Rebecca Laney, in for Frank King, and thanks for listening. If you'd like to travel to Palm Springs and hang with the cool kids of US Modernist next February during Modernism Week, send an email to george@ncmodernist.org. US Modernist Radio is underwritten by Sarah Sonk, the real estate agent who loves modernist houses just as much as you do. 919-601-7339. Okay, take us out, Tom.
Visit usmodernist.org for more information about today's guest. US Modernist Radio is edited by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song is performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. US Modernist Radio is a production of North Carolina Modernist Houses, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guile. George and Frank and I will be back in 2 weeks for another always right, never wrong, super duper Sean Spicer edition of US Modernist Radio.